I never believed I could be that person, the one who questions a 5-year relationship over coffee with someone I barely knew. But that's exactly what happened when I met James Miller, the quiet father of one of my third-grade students. One invitation, one afternoon at a cafe tucked away from prying eyes, and suddenly the future I had carefully planned with David began to blur around the edges. I wasn't looking for this. I wasn't looking for him. But sometimes life places people in your path at exactly the moment you didn't know you needed them. My name is Naomi Parker, and I've been teaching at Westbrook Elementary for 4 years. I love my job, the way children's eyes light up when they finally grasp a difficult concept, the crayon drawings they gift me that cover my refrigerator. Teaching was always my calling, even when David suggested I might want to pursue something more ambitious, as he put it. David and I met in college. He was charismatic, driven, and knew exactly what he wanted from life. I admired that about him. We'd been engaged for 5 years, always finding reasons to postpone the wedding, his promotion, my teaching certification, saving for a bigger ceremony. In retrospect, maybe those were signs I chose to ignore. The first time I noticed James Miller was during parent-teacher conferences. Unlike the other parents who rushed in and out, checking watches and phones, he sat attentively, notebook open, asking thoughtful questions about his son Liam's progress. "Liam mentions you often," he said as our time was ending. "He says you're the only teacher who really listens." There was something in his voice, gratitude perhaps, but also a hint of something deeper, a recognition of how rare genuine listening had become. I smiled, trying to ignore the warmth that spread through my chest at his words. "Liam is a special boy. He's going through a lot, but he's resilient." James nodded, a shadow crossing his face. "Since his mother passed, it's been difficult. Thank you for being patient with him." I hadn't known about Liam's mother. It explained so much about the quiet boy who would sometimes stare out the window, lost in thoughts too heavy for an 8-year-old. "I didn't realize," I said softly. "I'm so sorry for your loss." 3 years ago, he said, his voice steady but his eyes giving away the pain that still lingered. "We're managing." After he left, I found myself thinking about them, the single father and the boy who'd lost his mother too young. I made a mental note to pay more attention to Liam, to look for ways to support him. It was simply what any good teacher would do. Over the next few weeks, I noticed more about James when he picked up Liam after school. How he always knelt to be at eye level with his son while Liam excitedly shared stories about his day. How he carried Liam's backpack and art projects with the same care he might handle precious artifacts. I noticed the tiredness in his eyes, but also the unwavering attention he gave his son. One afternoon, when James arrived earlier than usual, he caught me organizing books in the classroom. Liam was still at music class. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, hovering near the doorway. "Not at all. Liam should be back in about 15 minutes. He nodded, still standing in the doorway as if unsure whether to enter or wait outside. "You can come in," I said, gesturing to a chair much too small for an adult. He smiled at the chair before carefully sitting down. "School furniture, bringing back memories, none of them comfortable." I laughed, surprised by his humor. In our previous interactions, he had been polite but reserved. "How's Liam doing?" he asked, his expression growing serious. "Really doing? Sometimes I'm not sure he tells me everything." The vulnerability in his question touched something in me. "He's doing better than he was at the beginning of the year," I said honestly. "He's making friends, participating more in class discussions. There are still moments when he gets quiet, withdrawn, but that's to be expected." James rubbed his forehead, a gesture I would come to recognize as a sign of his worry. "I never know if I'm doing enough, if I'm doing this right." "You are," I said without hesitation. "Believe me, I see all kinds of parents. Liam is loved, and he knows it. That's more than many children have." Our conversation continued until Liam burst into the classroom, excited to show his father the song he'd learned in music. As they left, James turned back to me. "Thank you," he said simply, but his eyes conveyed much more. That night, as David and I sat at our dining table, he talked about his day. A major deal his firm was closing, the potential bonus that would finally let us set a wedding date. I nodded and asked appropriate questions, but my mind kept drifting to the conversation with James, to the way he spoke about his son, to the genuine concern in his eyes. "Naomi, are you listening?" David's voice snapped me back to the present. "Sorry, long day," I said, forcing a smile. "Tell me more about the deal." As David continued, I realized with a pang of guilt that I couldn't remember the last time we'd had a conversation that wasn't about his work or our perpetually postponed wedding plans. When had we stopped talking about things that mattered? When had I stopped sharing my day with him, my thoughts, my concerns about my students? The next parent-teacher conference came around, and I found myself looking forward to my meeting with James. He arrived promptly, as always, notebook in hand. "Liam's made significant progress," I began, sharing examples of his improved work and social interactions. James listened intently, asking questions that showed he was genuinely invested in understanding his son's experience at school. As our official time came to an end, I hesitated, then made a suggestion that surprised even myself. "I have more thoughts about how to support Liam through some of his challenging days, but we're out of time. Would you maybe want to continue this conversation over coffee sometime?" The words hung in the air between us. Professional boundaries existed for a reason, and I just suggested crossing one. But it didn't feel wrong. It felt like the natural extension of our shared concern for Liam's well-being. James seemed startled, then thoughtful. "That would be helpful," he said finally. "Thank you." We arranged to meet that Saturday at a small cafe a few blocks from the school. I told myself it was purely about helping Liam. I told myself I would have done the same for any student who needed extra support. I almost believed it. I didn't mention the meeting to David. It wasn't a secret, I reasoned. It was work-related, and David's eyes tended to glaze over when I talked about my students anyway. Still, as Saturday approached, I felt a flutter of something in my stomach that I couldn't quite name. The cafe was quiet when I arrived, just a few patrons scattered at tables with laptops and books. I chose a corner table and ordered a latte, suddenly nervous. What if this was inappropriate? What if someone from school saw us? James arrived 5 minutes later, looking different in jeans and a casual sweater instead of the work clothes I was used to seeing him in. "Sorry if I'm late," he said, sliding into the chair across from me. "You're right on time," I assured him, pushing away the thought that he looked younger, more relaxed outside the school setting. For the first few minutes, we talked about Liam, about strategies for helping him express his feelings, about books that might help him process his grief. But gradually, our conversation shifted. He asked about my teaching, how I'd chosen the profession. I found myself telling him about my own third-grade teacher, Mrs. Lawson, who had made me feel seen when I was struggling after my parents' divorce. "She changed everything for me," I explained. "I wanted to do that for other kids." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "You're doing it for Liam." We talked for over an hour, moving from topic to topic with an ease that surprised me. He told me about his late wife, Emma, how they'd met in high school, how they'd grown up together, how her death from cancer had left him adrift, trying to be both mother and father to their son. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly. "I didn't mean to unload all of that on you." "Don't apologize," I said, meaning it. "Sometimes it helps to talk to someone who isn't directly involved." "You're easy to talk to," he said, his eyes meeting mine. I felt a warmth spread through me, a connection I hadn't experienced in longer than I cared to admit. "So are you," I replied softly. When we finally left the cafe, I felt lighter somehow, as if sharing conversation with someone who truly listened had lifted a weight I hadn't known I was carrying. "We should do this again," James said as we stood on the sidewalk. "To discuss Liam's progress," he added quickly. "Yes," I agreed, ignoring the voice in my head that whispered we both knew it wasn't just about Liam anymore. "That would be good." I returned home to find David on the couch, laptop open, barely looking up as I entered. "How was your day?" he asked absently. "Fine," I said, the richness of my morning conversation with James still resonating within me, making David's cursory inquiry feel hollow. "Just some work stuff." As weeks passed, coffee with James became a regular occurrence. We maintained the pretense that it was about Liam, and we did discuss him, but our conversations wandered to books we'd read, places we'd visited, dreams we'd had and lost. I learned that James used to paint before life got too busy with work and single parenthood. He learned that I'd once wanted to write children's books, but had set it aside when teaching and my relationship with David took precedence. "You should try again," he encouraged me one Saturday as rain tapped against the cafe windows. "I'd read your books to Liam." "Maybe someday," I said, touched by his faith in a dream I'd nearly forgotten. Meanwhile, my relationship with David continued on its predictable path. We functioned as roommates more than partners, sharing a space but rarely connecting on any meaningful level. I told myself this was normal, that the excitement fades in long-term relationships, that what David and I had was stable and secure, if not passionate. But each time I left a meeting with James, I felt more alive, more seen, more like the person I wanted to be. And each time I returned home to David, the contrast became harder to ignore. One evening, as David and I were getting ready for bed, he surprised me by bringing up our wedding. "I was thinking," he said, not looking up from his phone, "maybe we should just set a date, pick something and commit to it." I should have been excited. This was what we'd been working toward for years. Instead, I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. "What brought this on?" I asked, carefully keeping my tone neutral. He shrugged. "Time's passing. We've been engaged forever. People are starting to ask questions. People. Not I want to be your husband or I can't wait to start our life together, just people are asking questions." "Let's think about it," I said, unable to commit even to discussing dates. David finally looked up from his phone, his brow furrowed. "Is everything okay, Naomi? You've been distant lately." Had I simply stopped pretending that our relationship was fulfilling me? "I'm fine," I lied. "Just tired from work." He nodded, accepting my explanation too easily, and returned his attention to his phone. The next time I met James, something had changed. There was a tension between us, an awareness that had been building for weeks, but that we'd both been careful to ignore. "Liam asked about you yesterday," James said as we sat across from each other at what had become our table. "He wanted to know if you were my friend." I felt my cheeks warm. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were," he said simply. "I hope that's okay." "Of course," I replied, though we both knew that friend didn't quite capture what had been growing between us. "He's a perceptive kid." "He is," James agreed. "He also said I seem happier on Saturdays." Our eyes met, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. The implication hung in the air between us. "James," I began, not sure what I was going to say, but feeling the need to acknowledge the unspoken. "I know," he interrupted gently. "You're engaged, I respect that. I would never want to complicate your life." But it was already complicated. Every conversation, every smile, every moment of understanding between us had been complicating my life, making me question choices I'd thought were settled. "It's not just that," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're Liam's father." "I'm his teacher. There are boundaries." James nodded, his expression serious. "I understand. I don't want to put you in a difficult position." But as we continued our conversation, carefully steering to safer topics, I couldn't ignore the connection between us, the way time seemed to disappear when we were together, the way I felt fully myself in his presence. That night, I lay awake beside David, listening to his steady breathing, feeling like a stranger in my own bed. What was I doing? Was I throwing away a stable relationship, a future I'd planned for years, because of a few conversations with a man I barely knew? But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. James hadn't created the doubts about my relationship with David. He'd simply made them impossible to ignore. The question wasn't whether I was falling for James. The question was whether I had ever truly been in love with David at all. The next morning, I woke to David already dressed for work, briefcase in hand. "I have an early meeting," he said. "Don't forget we have dinner with my parents on Friday." I nodded, and he leaned down to kiss my forehead before leaving. The gesture felt empty, a habit rather than an expression of affection. I wondered if he felt it too, the distance between us, or if he was content with what we had. At school that day, I was distracted, my thoughts a turbulent mix of guilt, confusion, and longing. When James arrived to pick up Liam, our eyes met briefly before I looked away, afraid of what my colleagues might see in that glance. After the last student had left, I sat at my desk, trying to grade papers but unable to focus. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from James. "I know we shouldn't, but I need to talk to you, not about Liam, about us. The word sent a shiver through me. Was there an us? Could there be? I stared at the message for a long time before replying. Coffee shop. Tomorrow, 4 p.m. His response came quickly. I'll be there. I put my phone away, my heart racing. I was crossing a line and I knew it. But I also knew I couldn't continue as I had been, caught between the life I'd settled for and the possibility of something more. That night, David was unusually attentive, asking about my day, suggesting we watch a movie together. I wondered if he sensed something was wrong, if some instinct had warned him that I was slipping away. Are you happy, David? I asked as we sat on the couch, some action film playing that neither of us was really watching. He looked surprised by the question. Happy? Sure, we have a good life, don't we? Do we? I pressed. Sometimes I feel like we're just going through the motions. He frowned, turning to face me. Where is this coming from, Naomi? Is something wrong? I don't know, I admitted. I wonder if we want the same things anymore, if we ever did. He stared at me for a long moment, then sighed. Is this about the wedding? If you want to set a date, let's set a date. I'm ready whenever you are. But it wasn't about the wedding. It was about the fact that after 5 years together, David still didn't really see me, didn't understand what mattered to me. It was about the fact that a virtual stranger had connected with me on a deeper level in a few coffee meetings than David had in years. I need some time to think, I said finally. David looked worried now. Think about what? About us, about what I want. He was silent for a long moment. Is there someone else? He asked finally, his voice carefully controlled. The question hit me like a physical blow. Was there? James and I had never so much as held hands, but emotionally, hadn't I already been unfaithful? No, I said, the word feeling like ash in my mouth. There's no one else. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. There was someone else. Not in the way David meant, but in a way that mattered more. There was someone who saw me, who understood me, who made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. The next day, I arrived at the coffee shop early, my nerves raw, my thoughts a jumble of confusion and anticipation. When James walked in, our eyes met, and something passed between us, an acknowledgement of the territory we were entering. He sat across from me, his expression serious. I shouldn't have texted you, he began. It wasn't fair to put you in this position. I'm already in this position, I said quietly. We both are. He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. I've tried to keep this about Liam, about his education. I've tried to be respectful of your relationship. But Naomi, I can't pretend anymore that I don't feel something for you. His honesty took my breath away. I feel it too, I admitted, the words both terrifying and liberating, but I don't know what to do about it. I have a life commitments. I know, he said gently, and I would never ask you to throw that away, especially not for something so new, so uncertain. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our confessions hanging between us. What if it wasn't new? I asked finally. What if it's just that I've never felt this way before, not even with David? James looked pained. I can't tell you what to do, Naomi. I can only tell you that when I'm with you, I feel something I thought I'd never feel again after Emma died. And that terrifies me as much as it exhilarates me. I reached across the table then, taking his hand in mine. It was the first time we'd touched beyond the accidental brush of fingers passing coffee cups, and the contact sent a current through me that left me breathless. I need to figure things out with David, I said. Whatever happens, he deserves honesty. James squeezed my hand gently before letting go. Take the time you need. I'll be here. I left the cafe that day with a clarity I hadn't felt in months, maybe years. I knew what I had to do, even if it meant stepping into the unknown, even if it meant hurting someone I cared about. When I got home, David was waiting, sitting at the kitchen table with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of anger, hurt, and resignation. I found the texts, he said without preamble. My heart stopped. David, James, he cut me off. The father of one of your students, right? I need to talk to you about us. I'll be there. He quoted the messages with bitter precision. It's not what you think, I said automatically, then stopped myself. Wasn't it exactly what he thought? Hadn't I been emotionally invested in another man while still wearing David's ring? Then what is it? He demanded. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been lying to me. I never meant to hurt you, I said, the words inadequate but true. I've been confused trying to figure things out. Figure what out, whether you want to be with me or him. I flinched at the anger in his voice, but I couldn't deny the truth in his words. I don't know what I want, I admitted, but I know something's been missing between us for a long time. David stared at me, his expression hardening. So you went looking for it with someone else? I wasn't looking for anything, I insisted. It just happened. And it made me realize that we've been going through the motions. When was the last time we really talked, David? When was the last time you asked about my day and actually listened to the answer? So this is my fault, he asked incredulously. No, I said, shaking my head. It's not about fault. It's about the fact that we've been drifting apart for years, and neither of us wanted to admit it. The fight that followed was exhausting, painful, years of unspoken resentments and disappointments finally breaking free. By the end, we were both drained, sitting at opposite ends of the couch, the space between us a physical representation of the emotional distance that had grown over time. I think I should stay at my brother's tonight, David said finally, his voice hollow. I nodded, unable to ask him to stay, knowing it would be unfair to both of us. I'm sorry, I whispered as he packed an overnight bag. I never wanted it to end like this. He paused at the door, looking back at me. Did you ever love me, Naomi? Really love me? The question cut deep, forcing me to confront the truth I'd been avoiding. I did, I said honestly. But I think I loved the idea of us, the life we planned, more than the reality of what we became. He nodded, as if my answer confirmed something he'd suspected. Goodbye, Naomi. After he left, I sat alone in our apartment, the silence deafening. I had hurt someone who had been a part of my life for years, someone who, despite everything, I still cared about. And for what? For feelings that might lead nowhere, for a connection that might not withstand the complexities of real life. I didn't contact James right away. I needed time to sort through my own feelings, to make sure any decision I made wasn't just a reaction to the end of my relationship with David. He respected my space, sending only a brief text to make sure I was okay when I missed our usual Saturday coffee. 3 weeks later, as I was leaving school, I found James waiting by my car, Liam already buckled into his own vehicle nearby. I hope this is okay, he said, his expression uncertain. I didn't want to text, but I needed to see you. In the fading afternoon light, he looked both vulnerable and determined, a man who had also known loss, who understood that love was both a risk and a choice. It's okay, I said, feeling a calmness settle over me. I was going to call you anyway. You were, hope flickered in his eyes. I nodded. I ended things with David, for good. I'm sorry, he said, and I could tell he meant it. Are you okay? I am, I said, and it was true. There was sadness, of course, for the end of something that had been a significant part of my life. But there was also relief, a sense of finally being honest with myself and with David. It was the right decision, even if it wasn't an easy one. James studied my face, as if looking for confirmation that I truly was okay. And now, he asked softly. Now, I said, taking a deep breath, I think I'd like to see where this goes, slowly. He smiled then, a smile that reached his eyes and warmed something deep inside me. Slowly sounds perfect. As I drove home that day, I thought about the unexpected turns life takes, how a simple invitation for coffee had changed everything. I thought about the pain of endings and the hope of beginnings, about the courage it takes to be honest, both with others and with yourself. I didn't know what the future held for James and me. There would be complications, challenges, the need to navigate not just our own feelings, but Liam's well-being, the professional boundaries that still existed. But for the first time in a long time, I was following my heart instead of a predetermined plan, choosing authenticity over comfort. Sometimes, the hardest choices are the ones that lead us where we're meant to be. Sometimes, a cup of coffee is more than just a cup of coffee. It's the beginning of a journey back to ourselves, to the truth of what we really want and who we really are. And sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is admit when we've been on the wrong path, even if it means stepping into the unknown to find the right one.